A constitutional Homeland Security Association's structure. 1. Location. Ideally, the militia defend, protect, meet the critical needs of, and otherwise support we the people in any conceivable occasion and situation of danger in every locality throughout every state. Each CHSA, however, will be formed to promote revitalization of the militia in a particular locality in a particular state where a number of individuals has expressed an interest in advancing the cause of Homeland Security, and perhaps in volunteering for a militia company or other unit when a statute revitalizing the militia in that state is enacted. Initially, at least, this may be the only locality in that state, and that state the only one in the nation, in which a CHSA exists. The choice of location for a CHSA will turn, therefore, not so much on where its members and other supporters might be most needed in the future for militia purposes, as on where it can operate effectively in the present as an advocate for revitalizing the militia and as an educator with respect to how that should be done. After all, too many patriots assume that restoring any aspect of constitutionalism to contemporary America is well nigh impossible, because the tasks of proselytizing and organizing their country as a whole are too difficult. This mistakes the problem at hand. To begin the process of returning America to her constitutional fundamentals, patriots do not need to recruit most Americans most everywhere, but only enough Americans somewhere to prove the theory, establish the practice, and above all, set a successful example. If the sight of some Americans actually reestablishing self-government in their own locality by themselves does not animate many more Americans to join that endeavor in their own location, then America is doomed. For that reason, founders of CHSAs should determine which localities in their states provide the most favorable political, economic, social, and cultural climates for promoting revitalization of the militia, and then focus all of their efforts on those areas, or even only on a single area if such is the best opportunity available. Applying the principle that it is better to light one candle than to curse the darkness, the goal should be to strike just the proverbial single spark that can start a prairie fire, for which action the proper flint, steel, and tinder must be available and judiciously handled. Within each favorable locale, the founders must then decide on what regional basis one or more CHSAs should be organized. In some states, CHSAs may be able to take advantage of official militia districts already existing under the state's codes. Otherwise, whenever practicable, CHSAs should be set up according to prevailing political or geographical patterns. For example, by counties, townships, school districts, self-defined suburbs, such as incorporated communities, homeowners associations, or named developments, neighborhoods, particularly in cities or other densely populated areas, and so on, in order to conform as closely as contemporary conditions will allow to the precedents established by the pre-constitutional colonial and state militia, and to provide for continuity and reliability in membership. This approach may, however, prove to be unworkable or counterproductive in particular situations, in which case other principles specially suitable to the circumstances at hand should be devised and adopted. 2. Leadership. Once the founders have settled upon the most favorable locale and organizational foundation for a CHSA, they must determine how and on what basis the constituents of the initial leadership group, besides themselves, are to be identified, vetted, and recruited. The authority and power of the militia of the several states derive from and reflect the militia's identity with we the people, that the militia are the people, serve the people, and can entertain no purpose apart from or in opposition to the people. Therefore, each CHSA should strive to make itself a reflection, extension, and instrument of the people in its locality. Inasmuch as CHSA will initially have few members and even fewer leaders, those whom it does recruit in the latter capacity should embody such personal characteristics as will reflect the greatest credit on, and draw the largest dividends from, the community out of which they are selected. They must, of course, be volunteers. Beyond that, they must also be idealists of the strongest moral principles, realists who understand the pressing need to revitalize the militia as soon as possible, and especially pragmatists who can devise ways and means to accomplish that goal in a timely, efficient, and completely legal fashion in the face of apathy from their friends and calumny from their enemies. Moreover, they must have the self-assurance necessary to convince others to join with them, the obduracy necessary to weather opposition, and the persistence necessary to see the task through to completion, come what may. The initial core of a CHSA's leadership might most likely be formed from 1. Holders of state or local concealed carry permits, CCPs, and 2. Activists in rifle and pistol clubs and other groups that actually exercise and promote the right of the people to keep and bear arms. This is a matter not only of ideology, attitudes, knowledge, skills, and personal experience favorable to the Second Amendment, and therefore at least indirectly to the militia as well, that such individuals share, but also, perhaps especially, of practicality, namely that they can be easily identified, contacted, and encouraged to participate in revitalizing the militia. Typically, CCPs are public records, and gun clubs composed of patriots might make their membership lists available, or at least serve as intermediaries through which the founders of a CHSA could contact its members. Of the two sets of individuals, holders of CCPs and members of rifle and pistol clubs, the former might well contain more likely candidates for initial leadership positions in a CHSA. For through their CCPs, these people are already in fact serving as militiamen and performing Homeland Security functions in an ad hoc fashion, and need only to have that circumstance clarified for them to realize that participation in a CHSA is the natural collective extension of their CCPs. In contrast, members of the typical rifle and pistol club or other group promotive of the right of the people to keep and bear arms may lack any sound understanding of, let alone functional connection to, and perhaps particular enthusiasm for, the militia, either in principle or in practice when revitalization occurs. The problem in recruiting these people is that they might mistake a CHSA for just another Second Amendment advocacy association, which would render their participation unproductive and perhaps divisive until they were disabused of that notion and their energies redirected to the amendment's explanatory clause. From whatever source they recruit the initial core of leaders, the founders of a CHSA should be circumspect and selective. Doubtlessly, they will be personally familiar with some individuals and consider them sufficiently reliable to approach immediately and directly. Others, whose personalities, accomplishments, and standing in the community are unknown or open to question, should be carefully scrutinized and tested for suitability. The founders might, for example, send them complimentary copies of this book, asking them to respond to a survey as to whether and why they would volunteer to be cadres in a CHSA, and what they can contribute to the movement to revitalize the militia. In any event, at the beginning, numbers are far less important than quality, commitment, reputation, credibility, and capacity for hard work. The founders should search for individuals who are already culturally, socially, economically, or politically prominent figures in the community, or who otherwise exhibit honesty, virtue, and a potential for leadership and the successful assumption of responsibility. Moreover, the founders of a CHSA should realize that they will not necessarily be its natural leaders. There being no rule of seniority or abstract tests for true leadership, CHSAs must discover the right individuals by search and experiment, then allow direction to devolve upon them by dint of members' deference. Recommendations for leadership cadres should be diverse. A core group composed exclusively of gun people would be undesirable, because 1. Homeland security, the overarching purview of the militia, subsumes many matters as to which the use of firearms may have relatively little or no place, such as providing community services in response to natural disasters or economic crises. And 2. The militia are composed of we the people as an entirety, not just a few individuals with special skills or interests. And if its opponents can falsely paint the movement for revitalization of the militia as nothing more than an adjunct or outgrowth of the so-called gun lobby, they may prejudice Americans who would otherwise join if they believed it encompassed a broader base and served larger ends. This, of course, is not to deny that gun owners in fact represent a fair cross-section of Americans, and serve and promote ends that redound to the benefit of most of their countrymen. Nevertheless, in light of its crucial importance to the nation, and in anticipation of the controversy and even calumny that its enemies will generate in an attempt to throttle it at its birth, the movement for revitalization of the militia cannot afford the handicap of mistaken or misdirected public perceptions. 3. General membership. When recruiting members for a CHSA, its leaders should follow several rules of thumb. A. In promoting membership in a CHSA to the general public, leaders need to be scrupulously specific as to its character and purposes. Unfortunately, in contemporary popular discourse, and especially in the big media, the noun militia has been tainted, perforce of an almost exclusive application to various private groups of heavily armed individuals who sometimes express obnoxious beliefs and engage in obstreperous behavior. So, proponents of revitalizing the militia of the several states will inevitably and unavoidably find themselves confronted with the problem that all too many of their countrymen unthinkingly tend to visualize militia as drawn from or tending to appeal to a racist, sectarian, socially divisive, violent, or at least marginally criminal and generally anti-government and anti-democratic subculture composed largely of cretins and other degenerate and disreputable characters. American patriots, however, cannot relieve themselves of this rhetorical, propagandistic, and practical political handicap simply by the verbal device of renouncing any connection of their activities to militia. For the militia of the several states are the very constitutional establishments they need to revitalize. Militia is the very name, the only name, the Constitution recognizes for these establishments, based upon some 150 years of history in the colonies and independent states. And therefore any other designation would be at very best non-constitutional or extra-constitutional, and in the strictest sense even unconstitutional, inasmuch as, because the Constitution itself explicitly incorporates within its federal system the militia of the several states, no one, without a constitutional amendment, can set up some other entities in their place, or even assign them some different name. So patriots have no choice but to bite this bullet. And actually, though, viewed through the lens of legal logic, this is anything but a distasteful choice, because the constitutional position of the militia must convince every thoughtful American that revitalization of these establishments is not at all optional, let alone an outrageous proposal. Under these circumstances, proponents of revitalizing the militia of the several states must emphasize that the militia are governmental entities, performing governmental functions, and composed of members of the supreme governmental authority in this country. The militia are governmental entities because the Constitution, the charter of America's national government, expressly incorporates them as components of its federal structure. Moreover, the Constitution recognizes the militia as pre-existing and perpetual establishments of permanent character and purposes. The Constitution empowers Congress solely to provide for calling forth the militia, not to create them. This plainly implies that the militia exist independently of the general government. For if the militia were merely contingent creatures of the United States, only Congress, in which all legislative powers that the Constitution grants shall be vested, and which alone may make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution all powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States, could possibly create them. But the Constitution delegates no such power to Congress. Also, the Constitution empowers Congress to provide for governing such part of the militia as may be employed in the service of the United States. This plainly implies that the militia exist independently of the states' governments too. Otherwise, the states, simply by disestablishing their militia, could deprive the United States of the militia's service, which is a constitutional impossibility under Article 6, Clause 2 and 3. Even more significantly, the Second Amendment declares that a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state, compelling the conclusion that without a militia, a free state cannot come into other than merely transitory being. So the militia are governmental entities in the most practical sense possible, because without them, no free state could long endure at all. Moreover, because a free state and a republican form of government are synonyms in America's constitutional lexicon, a republican form of government cannot exist without a militia either. So because each of the several states must be a free state and must maintain a republican form of government, and because all of the several states together must comprise the more perfect union of the United States, and because the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government, therefore the Constitution serially recognizes, requires, and relies on the militia as the first and most important components of free republican government. Indeed, as the very foundations on which the continuance of such government depends in each state and in the United States as a whole. Not surprisingly, then, the functions the Constitution assigns to the militia are quintessentially governmental in character. In practice, Congress must provide for calling forth the militia to enforce the Constitution and other parts of the supreme law of the land, to execute the laws of the Union, and to protect the country against all enemies both foreign and domestic, to suppress insurrections and repel invasions. And the United States must guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government, doubtlessly through deployment of the militia when necessary, insofar as they are the forces the Constitution expressly assigns to counter invasions and domestic violence. Thus, the militia are the primary instruments, indeed, the defining components of constitutional homeland security, as to both law and order, and as such are primary instruments and components of government. For that reason, to impute advocacy or tolerance of illegal violence to proponents of revitalizing the militia of the several states would be self-contradictory and absurd. The militia are components, instruments, and the ultimate guarantors of law. Indeed, the supreme law of the land, not its opponents. Nothing the militia would do, in fact, to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, could even be arguably unlawful, because all such actions the Constitution expressly sanctions. The militia are the governmental entities, performing governmental functions, because they are composed of the supreme governmental authority in this country, we the people. The selfsame we the people, who do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America every day of its existence. The original Constitution treats the militia as pre-existing and perpetual institutions, precisely because the militia are we the people, and we the people are the militia. The general government and the states can no more create, dissolve, or disregard the militia than they can create, dissolve, or disregard their own creators and controllers, we the people ourselves. So, too, the Second Amendment expressly identifies the militia with we the people when it declares that, quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. In addition, the Second Amendment commands that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed because well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state. Consequently, in a free state, each and every individual comprising the people has a personal, political, or governmental duty to actually keep and bear arms in order to provide security to the state. Indeed, the security of a free state being of paramount importance, service in the militia is the primary and indispensable obligation of citizenship for all Americans. For that reason, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, which effectuates the militia's governmental power to provide that security, must be superior to and a limitation on all other governmental powers, because the continued existence of each and every one of those powers depends in the final analysis upon the untrammeled exercise of that right. Consider how important the right of the people to keep and bear arms is, arising as it does out of the privilege of self-defense, which is justly called the primary law of nature, and so is not and neither can it be, in fact, taken away by the law of society. The right and the duty of the people to throw off oppressive government, and the essential nature of all free governments, which must respect the laws of nature and of nature's God, and the people's unalienable rights. And we the people's specific intent to secure the common defense, that it would necessarily be implied as an inevitable, unavoidable constraint on all governmental powers under republican forms of government throughout the states and the United States, even without the Second Amendment or the militia clauses of the original Constitution. For the right of the people to keep and bear arms is the quintessence, the badge, and the ultimate means for enforcement of we the people's sovereign power. Thus, the Constitution, when written, foreshadowed and even now justifies, albeit with respect to the security of a free state and the guarantee of a republican form of government alone, the modern, often misused maxim that all political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. True enough, in the final analysis, all political power is imposed, in the face of resistance, by main force that is might, even in a free state. But as the Declaration of Independence recognizes, all political authority, that is, right, derives from the laws of nature and of nature's God. So, under the Constitution, out of the barrels of the militia's guns can grow only political power wholly consistent with such authority. The militia comprise the ultimate embodiments of popular force, namely, the states and the nation, through we the people keeping and bearing arms. As such, we constitute the vindicators of popular authority and the guarantors of popular sovereignty. For with we the people fully deployed and revitalized militia of the several states, there can arise no excuse for, or possibility of, and therefore no danger from, a national police state, or any other scheme at odds with a free state and a republican form of government, set up in the guise of Homeland Security. The remainder of the CHSA structure will be presented in the next part.